The desert had already taken everything from Elijah Crowe by the time the sun climbed high enough to turn the land into fire, and it showed no sign of stopping, because it did not care that he was a widower, nor that the bundle clutched to his chest was all he had left of the woman he loved, nor that the baby's cries had weakened into dry, broken sounds that barely carried through the heat, as Elijah staggered forward with dust on his tongue and blood on his boots. His horse long since collapsed behind him, its body left as a silent marker of how far hope could fall in this merciless land. And with every step Elijah felt the weight of failure press harder on his lungs. Because a man could survive hunger and thirst, but watching his own child fade was a torment beyond endurance. And as he looked down at Samuel's cracked lips and sunken eyes, he whispered apologies no baby could understand, promising protection he no longer had the power to give, while the desert stretched endlessly in all directions like a cruel joke. And it was in that moment when despair settled fully into his bones that the wind shifted in a way Elijah felt before he saw, a stillness that did not belong to nature. And when he turned, his breath caught in his throat, because 4 women stood on the ridge above him, unmoving, watching, their silhouettes sharp against the sky, their presence so quiet and controlled that it was more terrifying than any shouted threat. And Elijah's hand twitched toward a pistol he no longer carried, because the stories he had grown up on came flooding back, stories of Apache raids and frontier fear, but those stories shattered the moment. The women began to descend, the ridge not as hunters stalking prey, but as judges weighing truth, their dresses adorned with beadwork and fringe that spoke of identity rather than disguise, their faces calm, unreadable, and when they stopped a short distance away, none of them reached for a weapon, none raised a voice, and one of them, tall, steady, eyes sharp with understanding, looked past Elijah entirely and fixed her gaze on the baby. And in a voice neither harsh nor gentle but certain, she said, "Your child is starving." And the words hit Elijah harder than any bullet, because there was no accusation in them, only fact. And for the first time since his wife's death, Elijah felt the last of his pride crumble, because there was no room left for it, and he nodded, unable to speak for a moment, before forcing out the truth, telling them his wife was dead, his water gone, his horse lost, and that if they meant to kill him, he asked only that they spare the child the fear of watching it happen. And the women exchanged glances, silent and quick, their conversation carried in looks rather than words, before the same woman stepped forward again and delivered the sentence that would fracture Elijah's world forever, saying, "We will give your baby milk. He will live. But you will marry one of us." And the desert seemed to stop breathing as the words hung in the air, because Elijah did not hear a threat in them nor cruelty, but something older and heavier, a law shaped by survival rather than mercy, and his mind raced as he tried to understand the cost of what was being offered, because marriage was not a simple thing in the Wild West, and marriage across worlds was something men died for. Yet as Samuel whimpered weakly against his chest, Elijah realized that the world had already stripped him of comfort, safety, and certainty, and now it demanded a choice that would decide not just how he lived, but who he became. And as the Apache woman extended her hand toward the child, not grabbing, not forcing, only waiting, Elijah felt the truth settle deep in his soul, that love does not ask what is fair, only what is necessary. And with a shaking breath, he stepped forward and placed his son into the hands of strangers, crossing an invisible line that would forever bind his fate to theirs. If this story has you hooked already, subscribe to the channel. Now, because this is only the beginning of a Wild West legend you won't hear anywhere else. Elijah walked behind the 4 Apache women as the sun slid toward the horizon, his legs heavy not only from exhaustion but from the weight of what he had just agreed to, because a promise made for a child's life is not something a man can pretend away. And yet no one spoke of it as they moved through narrow canyons and hidden paths that Elijah would never have found on his own, the women navigating the land as if it whispered directions meant only for them. And when they finally reached the camp tucked deep within a bowl of stone and trees, Elijah felt something unexpected tighten in his chest, not fear, but relief, because life lived there, real life, not the lonely struggle he had known for weeks. And without ceremony, one of the women gently took Samuel from his arms and carried him toward a fire where an elder waited. And Elijah followed until his knees gave out and he sank to the ground, watching with blurred vision as his son was fed, the baby's weak cries turning into steady breathing. color slowly returning to his face. And in that moment, Elijah understood the full truth of the offer. Because whatever price he would pay, the debt had already been honored on their side. And over the days that followed, he remained in the camp as neither prisoner nor guest, but something in between, watched closely yet treated with a quiet respect. And he observed how the women worked, spoke, and decided together, how leadership did not shout but listened, how strength was measured not by how much one could take but by how much one could protect. And he learned that the 4 women were bound by a vow older than him, older than the settlements he came from, a vow to ensure the survival of their people in a world that seemed determined to erase them. And marriage, in their eyes, was not possession but responsibility, a joining that demanded loyalty, effort, and humility. And Elijah wrestled with his thoughts each night as he lay beneath unfamiliar stars, torn between the life he had lost and the one forming quietly around him, because accepting their ways meant shedding the stories he had been raised on, the lies whispered in saloons and churches alike. And when he spoke with Naya, the woman who had made the offer, he found no triumph in her eyes, only calm certainty. And she told him, "We did not save your child to take something from you. We saved him because life matters. The promise simply makes the future strong." And those words stayed with Elijah, reshaping his understanding of honor. And when the day came for him to choose, there was no crowd cheering and no celebration, only witnesses standing in silence, because this was not a victory but a binding. And Elijah spoke honestly, acknowledging the debt, the fear, and the gratitude that lived together in his heart. And when he chose Naya, it was not because he was forced, but because she had stood between his child and death without hesitation. And as the vow was sealed beneath the open sky, Elijah felt the final thread tying him to his old life loosen, replaced by something unfamiliar yet solid, like ground beneath a man who has been drifting too long. If this chapter is changing how you see the Wild West, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, because this story is building toward something unforgettable. Time moved differently. After the marriage, not marked by calendars or town bells, but by seasons, hunts, and the quiet growth of trust. And Elijah soon learned that becoming part of the Apache world did not happen with words alone, because respect was earned through action, patience, and humility. And every day tested him in ways no frontier town ever had, as he learned to move across the land without leaving wasteful tracks, to listen more than he spoke, and to understand that strength did not always announce itself. And though some in the tribe watched him with guarded eyes, others judged him only by what he did when no one demanded it. And Elijah worked alongside them, hunted when asked, protected when needed, and never once raised his voice in anger, because he understood that his place was not to dominate but to belong. And through it all, Samuel thrived, growing strong under many watchful eyes, passed from arms to arms without fear. A child claimed not by one world but by 2, and Elijah often caught himself watching. His son laughed beside the fires and wondering how close he had come to losing everything. And yet the peace he began to feel was not without shadow, because the frontier did not forget and rumors traveled. Nearby settlements that a white man lived among the Apache, bound by marriage, and to many that made Elijah a traitor rather than a survivor. And tension grew like a storm on the horizon, subtle at first, then undeniable, as riders were spotted at a distance and whispers passed through the camp. And Elijah realized that the choice he had made to save his child had placed a target on all of them. And when a group of armed men finally arrived demanding the return of their own, and accusing the tribe of theft and coercion, Elijah stepped forward before anyone else could speak, his heart pounding not with fear but resolve, because this time he was not begging for mercy. And he told them the truth plainly, that no chains bound him, that no threats were made, and that the life standing behind him, his wife, his child, his people, was one he chose freely. And the silence that followed was heavier than gunfire, because it forced everyone present to confront a truth they had long avoided, that the Wild West was not divided as cleanly as they believed. And though the confrontation passed without bloodshed, the warning was clear, that peace would never be guaranteed, and that Elijah's loyalty would be tested again and again. And as he stood beside Naya that night beneath a sky crowded with stars, he understood fully that saving a life was only the beginning, and that honoring that choice required courage every single day thereafter. If you're still with this story, now is the perfect time to subscribe, because the final chapter will bring this journey to its most powerful conclusion years later. Long after the dust of that first desperate bargain had settled into memory, the desert spoke Elijah Crowe's name with a different voice, not as a warning but as a reminder, because he had become something rare in a land shaped by division. A Pue, man who stood between worlds without trying to conquer either, and the camp that once watched him with caution now trusted him without question, because trust once earned is stronger than blood. And Samuel grew into a boy who ran freely beneath open skies, fluent in two ways of life, carrying no shame in his roots because he had been raised by many hands and many lessons. And when travelers passed through and heard the story of the Apache women's offer, they often misunderstood it, reducing it to rumor or scandal. But those who stayed long enough learned the truth, that the offer was never about control, but about responsibility, survival, and the belief that life was worth binding one's future to. And when conflict eventually came, as it always did on the frontier, Elijah stood firm beside his people, choosing protection over fear, unity over hatred, and restraint over vengeance, proving that courage is not found only in drawing a weapon, but in standing your ground when the world demands you pick a side. And as seasons turned and the old stories faded into new ones, Elijah often returned in his mind to that moment in the desert, when 4 women stood against emptiness and chose mercy without weakness, and he understood then what the Wild West truly was, not a place of endless violence, but a proving ground where the hardest battles were fought within the heart, and where a single choice could shape generations. And when Elijah finally grew old, sitting by the fire watching his son walk confidently into the future, he knew that the greatest legacy a man could leave was not land or reputation, but the courage to choose life when everything else says let go. And that is why this story endures, whispered like wind across the plains, reminding us that legends are not born from power alone, but from compassion strong enough to change fate itself. If this story stayed with you until the end, subscribe to the channel now because many more untold Wild West legends are waiting to be shared, and you won't want to miss them.